I'm going to show you how I used some very basic sewing plus Walmart curtains to make a red carpet worthy wedding dress. Out of all the gowns that I saw at the Oscars, I thought Ariana Grande's would be the most fun to recreate in my challenge series of Celebrity but Bridal. If you aren't familiar with this series, it's where I draw inspiration from a celebrity's gown and recreate it in bridal fashion, sharing the bridal sewing techniques that you can apply to all sorts of sewing projects, not just bridal. Per usual, this recreation has a twist. I made her gown with Walmart curtains. It actually turned out really beautiful, if I must say so myself. Now, let's get going making a DIY $30 wedding dress, shall we? Here I am starting with getting all of the creases and wrinkles out of the fabric. You don't want little squares and rectangles all over it. Now, this first segment is going to be with me doing a draping process. So I'm just going to pin the fabric to the dress form here. And I'm going to pin wherever we're going to need some darts to create all the curves that we need. What I'm going to do here is pin it so that it fits well. And then I'm going to mark it, you'll see that here in a minute, with some heat erasable ink. Actually, at this point, you could even use regular ink, but I don't want to mark up my dress form or anything by accident. So I like the heat erasable. But basically, I'm going to draw where all my future seams will be. Now, this is not creating the final pattern because that would be a little too tight. This is more like what we would call a sloper, where it's going to be kind of exactly the size and shape that the finished dress would need to be. So we're going to mark all these lines, and then when we lay it out, cut it out, we're going to use that to create our pattern. So we'll take this shape and we're just going to add the seam allowance all along the edges. It'll be like a little border that we draw. And I'll show you that in a minute. All of these details I'll show you. If you have any questions, as always, leave them down in the comments. I'm very active in the comments. So here's me cutting it out. Gonna go right along all of those lines, just exactly. Now, one trick, if you do want this to be a little more like your final pattern, you could do this on a dress form that's a size or two too big. Here I'm showing you how that side dart, if I pull it together, how it creates that bust curve. And here is the dart that's going up into what will be the princess seam. Now, some patterns have a traditional wider seam allowance, maybe something like 5/8 or something like that. But for this one, I'm just barely going to go over 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I don't like a lot of bulk in the gowns that I make. Now I'm going to drape the back, doing the same exact process. I'm going to put in just one long dart down the back, and I made sure the center back was on grain. This is the actual poly cotton that we saw there at Walmart, super cheap, pre-cut, that I bought to make this lining layer. Now, for brevity's sake, just so this video isn't too awfully long, I'm not lining this dress. To line the dress, you would just cut these pieces out 4 times instead of 2 times. So that way you would have all the parts you need to make the underlayer of the dress and the lining. Now I'm doing the same thing with the skirt. And I want a little bit of curvature there where the zipper is going to be along the center back seam as well. Now, when I do these celebrity but bridal videos in this series, The whole idea is to be inspired by their dress, but to push it a little bit more mainstream bridal. So this is if a bride came in and showed me a picture and said, I love this dress, I'm so inspired, but can we make a few changes to make it my wedding dress? So there will be a few design changes that I like to make in this process. And I'll tell you as we go along the things that will be a little bit different in my final dress versus Ariana's. Now you get to see that lovely seam allowance. You can see where I laid those sloper pieces out, and instead of making a pattern piece with them, I just went ahead and cut with that expanded border and used that. There's little Schmokey in the sewing room. He's going to help me sew this all together. These are some very simple seam lines that I put in here. But Ariana's dress had some simple seam lines in it. One thing I did that is quite different from hers was the bottom of the skirt. I changed the shape of it. So instead of it being a very narrow column straight skirt with the slit in the back, I decided to make the bottom of the skirt more of a fit and flare. So you're going to see that change come along as I'm sewing this. Here I'm just piecing everything together the traditional way of right sides together, finding every little piece. And I won't bore you with all the details, but you just sew all the parts together, and then this is going to be your base dress that you're going to put back on the dress form to do all of that ruching that we saw on her dress. Ruching is like those series of flat folds that go down a dress. They're kind of on the horizontal. They're very flattering and they're really fun to create. Let's put it on the dress form and see how it's going to look. So this top edge, I'm just folding down. Again, if I were making a final gown for a bride, I would definitely have made 2 of these lining layers so that one could be the lining and one could be this base piece that we're going to put all the ruching on. So here comes the fun part of draping the ruching. I went into a lot more detail when I did Taylor Swift's Grammy corset. That dress had a lot of ruching down the back, and I showed how you're going to have to put a tack. You're going to put a little stitch there for every pin that goes down the front princess seams of these gowns. So I'm getting ready to place a pin, and I'll show you right there. Yep, all of those pins that go along that line start at the bust and go down. Those are your princess seams. They would all need to be tacked in a really hidden way under that fold. But along the sides where I'm putting in the ruching, I'm going to show you a trick for how we can drape that on. Remember, this is draping, doing this on a dress form. How we can drape that on, but how we can machine sew that down. It's a lot easier than having to hand sew every single little tuck. At this point, I would encourage you to not try to make every ruche the same exact size and perfectly straight. There's a little bit of cattywampus going on here just to make them look a little more natural and a little more forgiving. So don't overthink it. On this channel, I do like to share stories with you as I sew. If you aren't familiar, Ariana Grande is a beautiful vocal sensation who wore a pink gown to the 2024 Oscars in a nod to her latest acting role as Glinda the Good Witch in Wicked. I'm going to tell you the story of her career as I sew this dress. So I'll kind of bounce back and forth. As I need to explain something, I'll explain it. Otherwise, just enjoy the relaxing beauty of the sewing and this craft and hearing her story. Once upon a time, in the sunny city of Boca Raton, Florida, a young girl with a voice as angelic as the morning dew was born. Little did anyone know that this girl, Ariana Grande, would grow up to become one of the most iconic pop sensations of our time. Now, here I am changing things up with this ruching, and I'm moving into what I was describing earlier. It's going to be more of a fit and flare. So we're going to let this skirt release and fill out in an asymmetrical design. So it's not going to be that tight column shape that Ariana had at the bottom of her dress. But if you want to get that look, just keep going with the ruching, just as I did at the top. As I'm putting all of these ruches in, I would like to appeal to your kindness. It costs you nothing, okay? But it means the world to me. Please tap the subscribe button. It's a small thing that you can do to keep this skilled trade alive. Now I'm going to cut along the side, making sure I don't strike any pins and ruin my shears, but I'm going to cut all this extra fabric off the side. Now, this is where that overlay fabric has crossed over the side seams. So I do need that extra fabric in there because it's going to go inside that seam allowance. Now, what I've done is I've put my stitch length on 4. So it's a longer stitch length. It's going to be really easy to pick out. And I'm sewing through all those layers, that lining layer that it's mounted to and the ruching. I'm sewing through those layers with those long stitches to the left of that side seam. That's going to hold all that ruching in place so that I can take my pins out and we can open the side seam and sew the dress back together, and the ruching will be enveloped in that side seam without me having to do any hand stitching. So that was that big trade secret I wanted to show you that can save you hours and hours of work. So there go our pins, and here I'm opening the side seams. Yes, I like to use a razor. It's okay if you prefer a seam ripper, but razors are so much faster. And I'm just going to rip open those side seams. It helps in the early stages of sewing just to go ahead and use those longer stitch lengths so that it's a little easier to undo these seams. Now I'm putting that back bodice piece back together. So we're sewing the side seams down, and we're going to look at it on the dress form and see how it looks. I think I would prefer a train be attached to this dress just to keep it a little more bridal themed. Now, Ariana Grande's dress, I don't know if you remember or not, but it had those sleeves. They were kind of like a ballooning style wrap, and they swooped down in the back and formed the train for her. So instead of having the train to be a part of the sleeves, I'm going to go ahead and attach it to the skirt for a more traditional fit and flare shape. Now, I didn't want you to have to watch me ruche the back, so I did the exact same steps back there as I did on the front. And then you saw me serging the hem. That's so quick with the serger. Now, what I'm sketching out here is just to show you how these sleeves are made, this wrap that she had. They gathered it, that was all my squiggles. They gathered the middle part, and then they sewed it together, leaving the right and left parts of that hole open. There you go, for her to put her arms through. Now, they used one continuous piece of fabric, so there was only one seam. we have limited ourselves to Walmart curtains. So I'm going to have to sew two of the curtains together to get it long enough. So I will have two seams, but it's still going to look fine. And I'm just kind of sketching the way that it draped down her back so you can kind of see it. And it had this gathered part there, and her gathered part was very flush. If you go back and look at those pictures, I'll add some in here for you too, but it was very flush. And I thought my brides would prefer two different things: that the gather was not flush, but more like a ruffle. And also I thought they would prefer the sleeves and the wrap to have a little bit less volume. Most of my brides do not like that much volume around their upper body. So instead of, what I could have done was stuffed this wrap with tulle to give it that fluffy loftiness. Instead of doing that, I just thought, no, I'm just going to let it drape just as this fabric would like to naturally drape. So here I'm showing it would be nice if it only had one seam and it was one continuous piece, but we're going to put the second seam here. So we're going to basically, I'll show you real quick. We're going to sew the two curtain pieces together, make a big loop, gather it along one side inside of there, and then we're going to seal it off, sew it together, except for those two armholes. So I'm going to knock the hem out of this curtain real quick and press it up and run it through the machine. There's the gather that's going to make it have this nice, it's like a frothy, ethereal, flowy kind of look to these sleeves, since we don't have that voluminous taffeta like Ariana was wearing. Now let's get back to her story. Ariana's journey began in the vibrant world of theater. From the tender age of 8, she graced the stages of local productions, captivating audiences with her undeniable talent. It wasn't long before her passion for performing led her to the bright lights of Broadway, where she enchanted audience with her role in the musical 13. This was merely the opening act of Ariana's grand performance lifestyle. Now here's the dress, top to bottom. That's very bridal looking, isn't it? Now let's look at these sleeves. And I put them on for fun so you could see them in motion. I think my brides would love that. It's kind of a mix between a sleeve and a veil, but it's not too poofy. It doesn't add a lot of visual weight. Don't forget, if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't lose track of me. As Ariana's career soared to new heights, so did her musical evolution. She grew up from a little girl performing into a very talented woman. She's also been a guest on several popular talk shows throughout her career. She can mimic almost any singing style and entertains with her impressions. Her appearances often include interviews, performances, and sometimes even comedic skits or games with the hosts. Her charm and talent have made her a sought-after guest and performer. I hope you've enjoyed this project. Don't forget, if you have any questions, leave them below. Also, I have other videos that show you some further details that were put into this project. You can learn all about how to add boning to dresses, how I put the invisible zipper in. I have a whole library of sewing knowledge for you to learn. It's great to have you, and welcome to the community.